how did English poetry begin? Who was the first English poet? Long ago, in the middle of the first millennium in England, people spoke Anglo-Saxon. They did not write in Anglo-Saxon. Certainly they didn't write poetry in Anglo-Saxon. The writing was in Latin. We sometimes call this Anglo-Latin. Latin writing was brought in the 500s by Christian missionaries from the continent. So the people spoke Anglo-Saxon, and the scholars wrote in Latin. But English poetry came out of the communication between the Anglo-Latin Christian scholars and the Anglo-Saxon language tradition. And it comes through a man named Caedmon. Now, what I'm about to tell you is from a first millennium English chronicle called The History of the English People by the Venerable Bede. And so this is a bit of a legend, and yet this is what we have from this age about the first English poetry. Now, the story goes that at a monastery where they would have studied Latin and known Latin, and yet the common people who were monks there or who worked there would have spoken Anglo-Saxon. At this monastery, there was a man named Caedmon. And Caedmon was embarrassed because he was not very skilled with words, with singing, with composition. And so apparently once he left a feast because he felt embarrassed at his lack of talent. And Caedmon falls asleep. And the Venerable Bede records this. In due time he stretched himself out and went to sleep, whereupon he dreamt that someone stood by him, and saluted him and called him by name. Caedmon, he said, sing me something. Caedmon answered, I cannot sing. That is why I left the feast and came here, because I cannot sing. Once again the speaker said, nevertheless, you must sing to me. What must I sing? Said Caedmon. Sing, he said, about the beginning of created things. Thereupon, Caedmon began to sing verses which he had never heard before, in praise of God the Creator, of which this is the general sense. Now we must praise the Maker of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the Creator and his counsel, the deeds of the Father of glory, and how he, since he is the eternal God, was the author of all marvels, and first created the heavens as a roof for children of men, and then the almighty guardian of the human race created this middle earth. This is the sense, but not the order of the words which he sang as he slept. For it is not possible, Bede writes, to translate verse, however well composed, literally from one language to another, without some loss of beauty and dignity. When he awoke, he remembered all that he had sung while asleep, and soon added more verses in the same manner, praising God in fitting style. So Bede is writing in Latin and telling us about this sort of miraculous God-given ability that created the first English poetry. Bede explains that this man, Caedmon, went on to compose, he says, godly and religious songs. Thus, whatever he learned from the Holy Scriptures, which would have been in Latin, by means of interpreters, he quickly turned into extremely delightful and moving poetry in English, which was his own tongue. By his songs, the minds of many were inspired to despise the world and to long for the heavenly life. It is true that after him other Englishmen attempted to compose religious poems, but none could compare with him, for he did not learn the art of poetry from men, nor through a man, but from the gift of God. So, Caedmon is the first recorded poet that we have who wrote in English. And it says particularly he wrote what he learned from the scriptures, the Latin scriptures, this would be the Latin Vulgate, he translated into English. Now, this wouldn't have been a direct translation, like word for word. That does take place over the centuries in England. This would be more the sense or the stories that he hears are translated into English verse or paraphrased in English verse. And it's interesting. Bede, who is quite the scholar of Latin poetry, clarifies, oh, I can't literally translate, sense for sense and meter for meter what's going on in the English of Bede. This is sort of an approximation. We have preserved in other manuscripts, not in Bede's, the actual Anglo-Saxon verses of that poem that I read to you. We also have, interestingly enough, a couple long narrative compositions in Anglo-Saxon, which retell the Genesis story and the Exodus story. Now, these are traditionally thought to be like either by Caedmon or the kind of things he wrote. And to this day, we don't exactly know. There are arguments for, Caedmon literally composed this, paraphrase of Genesis that we have in Anglo-Saxon verse. Other people say he didn't. But if we're going to talk about the history of English poetry, we need to see that the beginnings, at least according to the earliest historians in England on the ground, the beginnings are in this sort of Caedmon tradition. This man who hears in Latin but expresses in the most beautiful English.